The late spring of 1883 in Willow Creek, Indiana, felt particularly heavy, not just with the impending summer humidity, but with an unspoken tension that had begun to settle over the small, insular community. Nestled deep within the whispering embrace of ancient forests, Willow Creek was a settlement of modest clapboard houses, their paint peeling under the relentless sun, all gathered around the slow, meandering currents of the White River. Life here was simple, dictated by the rhythm of the seasons, planting, harvest, and the unwavering toll of the bell from St. Jude's Parish, the town's only edifice of solid stone. In Willow Creek, secrets, like weeds, tended to find fertile ground and flourish, though usually in plain sight. Yet a darker, more insidious one had festered, unseen, for decades, poisoning the very spirit of the town. At the heart of Willow Creek, and indeed, at the heart of its spiritual life, stood Father Michael O'Malley. For nearly 40 years, his weathered face, a tapestry of lines etched by prayer and unwavering devotion, had been as constant a fixture as the sunrise itself. He was the unwavering pillar of rectitude, the silent confessor of sins, and the steadfast shepherd to a flock whose lives rarely ventured beyond the comforting, interconnected familiarity of their neighbors. But as the dogwoods bloomed and the days grew longer in '83, a profound and disturbing change began to manifest in the old priest. A pallor deepened on his skin day by day, and a persistent tremor, subtle at first, began to shake his once steady hands, betraying an inner turmoil. He became a spectral figure in the twilight hours, often found standing vigil by the narrow, wrought-iron gate of the church cemetery. His gaze, fixed and unnervingly distant, would fall upon a cluster of unmarked graves huddled at the furthest, most desolate edge of the consecrated ground. The townsfolk, long accustomed to Father O'Malley's solitary habits and his quiet contemplation, initially paid little mind to these increasing vigils. However, the sheer frequency of his presence there, coupled with the noticeable and rapid deterioration of his physical frame, began to stir a quiet, creeping concern among the more observant members of his congregation. Those who understood the subtle shifts in the human spirit, whispers, light and fleeting as the rustle of dry leaves caught in a gentle breeze, began to circulate, carrying with them an unspoken fear. Sarah Miller, the dedicated and watchful sacristan of St. Jude's, whose life revolved around the rhythms of the church, often found him in these moments of profound solitude. She would approach him gently, her steps soft on the gravel path, and offer him simple comforts: a warm, steaming broth to soothe his chilled frame despite the mild air, or a woolen blanket to drape over his increasingly frail shoulders. He would accept these gestures with a grateful, though almost imperceptible, nod, his eyes remaining distant, troubled, and clouded by an invisible sorrow. The usual warmth that had once emanated from his gaze, a comforting beacon for his parishioners, was now replaced by a haunted, deeply knowing sorrow, the unbearable burden of a truth he seemed to carry alone, too heavy to share. It was the look of a man in a silent, desperate wrestle with an immense, unspoken revelation. As July descended upon Willow Creek, bringing with it a sweltering, oppressive heat that seemed to press down on everything, Father O'Malley's decline only accelerated. Once a man of robust constitution, with a vigor that belied his advancing years, he now moved with the slow, deliberate, almost agonizing steps of one nearing the inevitable conclusion of their earthly pilgrimage. His sermons, once rich with scripture, infused with comforting parables, and delivered with a quiet authority, grew progressively shorter, punctuated by long, disquieting silences that hung heavy in the air. A profound sense of foreboding, as palpable and suffocating as the oppressive humidity itself, began to settle like a shroud over St. Jude's Parish, extending its eerie tendrils to envelop the entirety of Willow Creek, binding them all in a shared, chilling apprehension. The small, hallowed confessional booth at St. Jude's, meticulously carved from dark, unyielding oak, had always stood as a sanctuary within the church. It was a sacred space where the burdens of the human soul were laid bare, where whispered transgressions sought absolution, and where the fragile spirit found solace in the promise of divine mercy. For Father O'Malley, this dim, intimate chamber had been the very crucible of his lengthy ministry, a silent, unwavering witness to the myriad triumphs and profound failures of the human spirit that had passed through its veiled screen. Now, however, in his final, fading days, the confessional seemed to weigh upon him, not as a source of comfort, but as a dark, inescapable shadow, a testament to something he could not, or would not, confront. He steadfastly refused to hear confessions, citing a sudden, overwhelming weakness, and the few earnest parishioners who dared to approach its familiar door found it uncharacteristically barred, a symbol of his withdrawal. This unprecedented refusal sent ripples of unease through the community. The confessional was, after all, the very heart of his priestly duties, a sacrament he had never once forsaken, not even during the harshest, most unforgiving winters that had blanketed Willow Creek in snow, nor during the most virulent fevers that had swept through the town. His inexplicable unwillingness to enter its dimly lit confines, to fulfill this fundamental role, only served to fuel the growing anxieties and unsettling rumors within the community. People began to speak in hushed tones of a curse, a spiritual malaise of unknown origin that had gripped their beloved priest, forcing him to turn away from the very core of his sacred faith, abandoning a duty he had held for decades. One sweltering afternoon, as the cicadas droned their incessant chorus, Martha Gable, a widow known for her unwavering piety and her remarkably sharp, observant eye, discovered Father O'Malley standing motionless before the confessional door. His face was pale, almost ashen, and contorted with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate apprehension. He was muttering to himself, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, fragments of phrases like "the weight of the unspoken" and "the grave's unforgiving silence." Martha, a woman not easily swayed by superstitious whispers or idle gossip, felt an icy chill crawl slowly up her spine, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that pressed down on the town. A profound sense of dread settled over her. His nights became increasingly tormented, his sleep plagued by nightmares that were both frequent and disturbingly vivid, if the haunting sounds emanating from the rectory were any indication. Sarah Miller, whose small, modest cottage stood adjacent to the church grounds, often heard his anguished cries echoing through the otherwise still and silent night. Sometimes, they sounded like desperate pleas, choked and raw, as if begging for release from an invisible tormentor. At other times, they were strangled accusations, directed at no one, yet filled with an unbearable anger and sorrow. Whatever the specific nature of the demons that haunted his restless sleep, they were relentless, unforgiving, and seemed intent on tearing at the very fabric of his soul, denying him any peace. Dr. Elias Thorne, the town's only physician, a man of science and pragmatism, visited Father O'Malley daily, tirelessly prescribing a series of tonics and insisting upon complete rest. Yet he knew in his heart, with a grim certainty, that no earthly medicine could offer a true cure for the mysterious malady that afflicted the priest. "His spirit is burdened beyond measure," Dr. Thorne confided to Sarah one evening, his voice hushed and heavy with genuine concern. "There's a deep, corrosive sorrow within him, a hidden knowledge that is slowly, inexorably consuming him from the inside out." The entire town of Willow Creek collectively held its breath, awaiting the inevitable, somber conclusion to the priest's inexplicable decline, feeling the shadow of his suffering fall over them all as the summer intensified its relentless grip on Willow Creek, baking the very earth until it cracked and wilting the once vibrant corn in the fields to a brittle straw. So too did the fever finally seize Father O'Malley, pulling him inexorably into its relentless, consuming embrace. He lay prostrate in his simple, ascetic bed within the rectory, the small room stifling and airless, his breath now shallow, ragged and alarmingly strained. Sarah Miller, along with a few other dedicated and compassionate women from the parish, took turns at his bedside, a silent vigil of unwavering care. They moistened his parched lips with cool water and murmured endless, heartfelt prayers, their voices soft against the harsh reality of his failing health. Each breath he took seemed a monumental effort, a testament to a life force slowly ebbing away. His feverish ramblings began subtly at first, disjointed words escaping his lips like dry leaves carried on a faint breeze, names half-formed and indistinguishable on his parched tongue. But as the relentless days bled imperceptibly into the long, stifling nights, and his already frail body grew progressively weaker, the words gained an unnerving clarity, becoming clearer, more insistent, and laced with an increasing urgency. He spoke in a raspy whisper, of the children of the river, and of the weeping willow, images that, to those attending him, held no immediate or apparent meaning, yet sent inexplicable shivers of dread crawling down their spines. The very air in the rectory, thick with the heat and the scent of illness, grew heavy with an unspoken chilling dread, as if the room itself was holding its breath. One evening, as a tempestuous storm gathered ominously on the horizon, painting the western sky with bruised purples and menacing grays, Father O'Malley thrashed violently in his bed, his eyes wide, unseeing, and filled with an unspeakable terror. He cried out, a guttural sound of raw anguish that tore through the quiet room. "Forgive me, forgive them." His emaciated hands clawed desperately at the thin blanket, as if trying to grasp something unseen, something elusive and terrifying that tormented him from beyond the veil of his fever. The women attending him exchanged nervous, frightened glances, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering, unsteady lamplight, each silently acknowledging the profound distress that racked his soul. Amidst his tormented cries, he began to speak of a terrible silence, of voices stifled, and a dark secret buried. These words, though still fragmented and interspersed with feverish moans, began, piece by piece, to paint a disturbing and grotesque mosaic in the minds of those who listened, their own hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. They were not the mere ravings of a man utterly lost to delirium. Rather, they were the desperate, final attempts of a dying man to unburden his soul, to confess a profound and horrifying truth that had weighed upon him, a silent, corrosive poison, for decades. The tempest raging outside the rectory with its crashing thunder and relentless rain seemed to mirror the internal tempest that consumed his very soul, a desperate struggle for truth. Dr. Thorne, arriving during a momentary lull in the torrential downpour, his face grim and etched with fatigue, shook his head gravely. "He's fading fast," he whispered softly to Sarah, his voice heavy with the inevitable prognosis as he checked the priest's faint, fluttering pulse. "His heart is failing, his strength completely gone." As a deep, resonant rumble of thunder echoed once more in the distance, a sound that shook the very foundations of the rectory, Father O'Malley's eyes snapped open, suddenly lucid, piercingly clear. He looked directly at Sarah, his gaze unwavering, and in a voice that, surprisingly, held a final, desperate strength, he whispered, his words cutting through the humid air, the orphanage fire." The whispered mention of the orphanage fire sent a chilling, visceral jolt through Sarah Miller. The St. Augustine's Orphanage, a sprawling, once proud institution located just on the quiet, verdant outskirts of Willow Creek, had burned to the ground nearly 30 years prior, a catastrophic tragedy that had claimed the innocent lives of 23 children and 3 devoted nuns. It was a memory etched deeply and painfully into the town's collective consciousness, a raw, unhealing wound that had never truly scarred over. The official cause, as proclaimed by the authorities and accepted by a grieving community, had been a faulty chimney, an accidental and heartbreaking loss, a cruel twist of fate that had left Willow Creek in mourning. But Father O'Malley's voice, though now barely a whisper, carried an unmistakable and horrifying urgency, a desperate plea for the truth. He began to speak of the orphanage fire with a clarity that utterly belied his feverish state, his words painting a chilling, grotesque picture of that terrible, fateful night. He described not the chaotic, uncontrolled inferno of an accidental blaze, but rather the deliberate, methodical act of ignition, a horrifying crime veiled and obscured by the all-consuming flames, a calculated atrocity. The women gathered around his bed, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light, listened in stunned silence, their expressions a chilling mixture of profound disbelief and a dawning, sickening horror as the full weight of his revelation began to sink in. The children, they were locked in. He rasped, his voice tearing at his throat, his eyes wide and unseeing, consumed by a terror that transcended his physical pain. The sister, they tried desperately to save them, but the doors, they were barred from the outside, secured, immovable. He spoke of the suffocating, acrid smoke that filled the air, the agonizing screams that were abruptly silenced, and the sinister orange glow that had consumed the night sky. A horrific spectacle that had haunted his dreams. A relentless torment. For decades, the comforting, fabricated official narrative of the accident crumbled instantly, dissolving into ash under the sheer, unbearable weight of his desperate, dying confession, revealing the monstrous truth beneath. He revealed, with painstaking, agonizing detail, that he had been one of the very first to arrive on the scene that night, drawn by the thick plumes of smoke that billowed into the night and the terrified, desperate shouts that carried on the wind. He had marred with his own eyes, witnessed the horrifying truth, the unyielding, immovable locks, the deliberate, calculated trapping of innocent lives within the burning structure. But he had been young then, a newly ordained priest, and utterly terrified. The powerful, shadowy figures who had orchestrated the cover-up had swiftly silenced him with a barrage of veiled threats and chilling intimidation, mercilessly exploiting his sacred vows of secrecy and unwavering obedience. He had carried the unbearable burden of this monstrous truth alone, a silent, festering wound, for 30 long, agonizing years. The names he whispered, barely audible, were those of prominent families, pillars of the community, whose wealth and influence had been meticulously built upon obscured and deeply nefarious foundations. He spoke of bitter land disputes, of a rapacious desire to expand their sprawling properties, and how the orphanage, standing squarely in their path, had become an inconvenient obstacle. The fire, he insisted with his dying breath, was not an accident, but a brutal, calculated act of forced eviction, a horrifying atrocity cunningly disguised as a tragic accident. The truth, finally escaping his parched lips after decades of tormented silence, was far more monstrous, more depraved, and more unimaginable than any in Willow Creek could have ever dared to conceive, shaking the very foundations of their understanding. Father O'Malley's confession, now a desperate torrent of fragmented revelations, continued to flow from his weakening body, each word growing fainter, more strained, as his life force ebbed away. He spoke in hushed, trembling tones of the Council of Shadows, a clandestine and malevolent group of powerful men who met in secret, their illicit decisions shaping, with insidious precision, the very fabric of Willow Creek's destiny. He implicated figures long dead and buried, men who had been revered for their civic contributions, their names enshrined in local history, now brutally exposed as the true orchestrators of unspeakable cruelty and heartless ambition. The sheer crushing weight of their pervasive influence had not only orchestrated the atrocity, but had also systematically suppressed the truth, meticulously ensuring their culpability remained forever buried beneath layers of deceit and fear, far from any public scrutiny or justice. He described Khan with a chilling precision that belied his failing health, the relentless intimidation he had faced, the veiled threats that had been whispered against his very life, and, even more cruelly, against the lives of those innocent souls he held most dear, his beloved parishioners. The fear, he explained, had been a living, breathing entity, a cold, coiled serpent forever lodged deep within his gut, a constant, gnawing presence that had ruthlessly silenced him for decades, paralyzing him with the terror of inevitable reprisal. His sacred priestly vows, once intended to be a profound source of strength, comfort, and unwavering moral guidance, had been insidiously twisted against him, perverted and manipulated to enforce his agonizing silence. The profound sanctity of the confessional, which he had so strictly upheld throughout his ministry, now seemed a cruel, mocking irony, a silent testament to his tortured predicament. The evidence of the calculated crime, he claimed with a desperate urgency, had been systematically and meticulously destroyed. Every lingering trace of arson painstakingly removed and obliterated long before the official, perfunctory investigation had even commenced. The local sheriff, Tar, a man deeply beholden to the insidious influence of these unseen hands and their vast network of power, had been effortlessly manipulated, his findings predetermined and fabricated to suit their sinister agenda. The town of Willow Creek, desperate for a quick and comforting closure, and perhaps more accurately, utterly unwilling to confront such a terrible, soul-shattering truth about their esteemed leaders, had passively accepted the carefully fabricated narrative without question, allowing the truly guilty to walk freely, untouched by justice, their consciences undisturbed by the screams of the innocent. His dying confession laid bare the dark, festering underbelly of Willow Creek, tearing away the deceptive facade of a town that had long prided itself on its moral fortitude and unwavering rectitude. The public benevolence of the powerful, the seemingly selfless charity of the wealthy, all were now revealed to be nothing more than a thin, transparent veneer stretched taut over a core of ruthless, avaricious ambition and a shocking, depraved disregard for human life. The orphanage fire, he hinted with a final chilling breath, was not merely an isolated incident, a singular act of calculated cruelty, but rather the most egregious and undeniable atrocity in a deeply disturbing pattern of quiet corruption, insidious manipulation, and cold, calculated malevolence that had plagued Willow Creek for generations, an unseen rot at its very core. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to appear on the horizon, painting the eastern sky with fragile hues of rose and ethereal gold, Father O'Malley finally fell silent, his breath now barely perceptible, a mere whisper against the heavy air. He had, with his last ounce of strength, emptied his very soul, spilling forth the decades of profound torment, the unspeakable truth that had consumed his entire life, festering within him like a fatal disease. The small rectory room hung heavy with the oppressive weight of his shattering words, a cold, unyielding reality that had brutally shattered the long-held, comforting illusion of Willow Creek's peaceful innocence. The unseen hands, he implied with his final, silent moments, still held absolute sway, their spectral grip unwavering and eternal. With the full ascent of the morning sun, casting long, pale shadows across the rectory floor, Father O'Malley's tormented earthly journey finally reached its end. His final breath was a faint, almost imperceptible sigh, a whisper of profound release from a burden too colossal, too agonizing for any single man to bear alone. The small room, now filled with the hushed reverence and quiet sorrow of death, also vibrated with the raw, shocking resonance of the revelations that had poured forth from his dying lips. Sarah Miller, her face tear-streaked and ghostly pale, felt the very foundations of the world she had always known shift violently beneath her feet, irrevocably altered by the horrific truths she had just witnessed. The comfortable, familiar narrative of the orphanage fire had been violently torn away, replaced by a grotesque, agonizing truth that now demanded, with an unbearable urgency, to be acknowledged. The other women who had been present during Father O'Malley's final confession, their faces etched with stunned disbelief and profound disquiet, retreated quietly from the room, their movements hesitant, their minds reeling from the enormity of what they had heard. Each carried a mixture of grief for their beloved priest and a deep, unsettling unease. The comfortable, long-accepted narrative of the orphanage fire, which had allowed them a measure of peace, had been brutally shattered, replaced by a grotesque, unimaginable truth that now screamed for recognition. But who, in their right mind, would ever believe the fevered, terrifying confession of a dying priest, even one as universally revered and respected as Father O'Malley? The forces he spoke of, the Council of Shadows, were too powerful, too deeply entrenched in the very fabric of Willow Creek society to be challenged by a deathbed whisper. Sarah, however, was not one to casually dismiss the final desperate words of a dying man, particularly a man of Father O'Malley's unwavering integrity, his lifelong dedication to truth and faith. She had known him her entire life, had witnessed his quiet, solitary suffering, his profound struggle with an unseen torment, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty deep within her heart, that his confession, no matter how horrifying or unbelievable it seemed, was the absolute truth. The immense weight of his dying wish, the silent, desperate plea for the truth to finally be known, for justice to be served, settled upon her shoulders like a heavy, suffocating shroud, a sacred trust she could not, would not, betray. The news of Father O'Malley's passing spread rapidly through the close-knit community of Willow Creek, bringing with it a predictable wave of public mourning and heartfelt condolences. But for those few individuals who had been privileged, or perhaps cursed, to be present in the rectory during his final hours, a different, more profound kind of grief took root, a grief inextricably mingled with acute fear, righteous anger, and a chilling, pervasive sense of betrayal that now tainted their perception of their hometown. The funeral was a somber, deeply attended affair, drawing nearly every soul in Willow Creek, a testament to the beloved priest's revered standing in the community, his lifetime of service. As his simple coffin was slowly lowered into the hallowed earth of the church cemetery, resting not far from the cluster of unmarked graves he had so often visited in his final days, Sarah Miller felt a cold, resolute determination solidify within her. The truth, though terrifying and dangerous to confront, could not, under any circumstances, be allowed to die with Father O'Malley, to be buried alongside him in the cold ground. The innocent children of the orphanage, whose lives had been so brutally and senselessly extinguished, and the brave, devoted sisters who had died trying in vain to save them, deserved justice, deserved to have their story told, even if that justice was merely the agonizing revelation of a long-buried, unspeakable horror that had been hidden from the light for too long. In the weeks and long, dragging months that followed the somber death of Father O'Malley, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to permeate the very atmosphere of Willow Creek. The light, innocent whispers that had once been the town's currency of gossip, fleeting and harmless as dandelion seeds on the wind, now carried a heavier, more resonant echo, imbued with a nascent, chilling unease. The confessor's final, desperate words, spoken on the precipice of death, had inadvertently touched more ears than anticipated, their horrifying implications resonating silently within a select few. And though no one dared to speak of them openly, afraid of the repercussions, the insidious seeds of doubt had been irrevocably sown in the rich, dark soil of the town's collective consciousness, waiting for the right conditions to sprout into full-blown dread. Sarah Miller, now more than ever, found herself irresistibly drawn to the quiet solitude of the rectory. She spent countless hours sifting meticulously through Father O'Malley's meager, carefully preserved belongings, not out of morbid curiosity, but driven by a desperate, fervent hope for corroboration, a tangible piece of evidence that would validate his shattering confession. She discovered his worn, leather-bound journals, filled with deeply personal theological musings, mundane daily observations, and eloquent scripture passages, but no explicit, direct mention of the orphanage fire beyond the official, accepted narrative. Yet, in the cramped margins, and subtly woven between the lines of his carefully penned thoughts, she began to discern a haunting pattern of subtle anxieties, veiled references to unseen burdens, unbearable silences, and truths too heavy to carry alone, cryptic indicators of his decades-long torment. The cluster of unmarked graves in the church cemetery, once merely a distant, mournful sight on the periphery of the consecrated ground, now held a chilling, profound significance for Sarah. She looked at them with a new, horrifying understanding, her heart aching with a fresh grief. They were not just anonymous markers of forgotten souls. They were silent, agonizing screams, indelible testimonies to a heinous crime that had been systematically and ruthlessly erased from the town's memory. She spent long, solitary hours there, feeling the almost palpable presence of the innocent lives tragically lost, their spectral voices urging her, compelling her, to continue her quiet, dangerous search for the truth, to give them the voice they had been denied. Her gaze, now sharpened by Father O'Malley's revelation, constantly lingered on the powerful families he had so bravely implicated. Their public faces still radiated an air of unassailable respectability. Their generous charitable contributions still lauded and praised throughout Willow Creek. But Sarah now saw them through a starkly different lens, a lens tainted irrevocably by the priest's dying words, revealing a disturbing duality. Their smiles seemed a little too fixed, their benevolence a little too performative, their eyes holding a calculating glint that she had never noticed before. The unseen hands, she realized with a cold shudder, those clandestine orchestrators of Willow Creek's fate, were still very much at play, their insidious grip on the town, its wealth, and its secrets, absolute and unyielding. The immense weight of the monstrous secret grew heavier for Sarah with each passing day, pressing down on her spirit. She keenly felt the profound isolation of carrying such a dangerous and soul-shattering truth, a burden too immense to share openly, to speak openly, to directly accuse these powerful families would undoubtedly invite ridicule, dismissal, and perhaps even violent reprisal. Yet, to remain silent, to allow the truth to die with Father O'Malley and be forever buried, felt like an unforgivable betrayal of his sacred dying wish and a profound disservice to the memory of the innocent children who had perished in the flames. Willow Creek, once a comforting picture of pastoral tranquility, now felt to Sarah like a gilded cage, its beauty a deceptive facade built directly upon a hidden mass grave, its very foundations resting on lies. Years, like the relentless currents of the White River, continued to flow steadily through Willow Creek. The vivid memory of Father O'Malley, once sharp and vibrant in the town's collective consciousness, began, inevitably, to soften around the edges, slowly receding into the mists of time. He gradually transformed into a fond, if somewhat tragic, chapter in Willow Creek's lengthy and quiet history. His personal torments and final revelations largely forgotten by the majority. The official, comforting narrative of the orphanage fire remained untouched, its placid surface unblemished by the agonizing, dying words of a tormented priest, forever preserved as a tragic accident. The powerful families, their names still whispered with a deep, ingrained deference and respect, continued their lives unmolested, their vast wealth and influence securing their positions, their horrifying secrets safely interred beneath layers of time and public acceptance. Sarah Miller, however, was different. The profound unburdening of Father O'Malley, his final, desperate confession, had etched itself indelibly into her very soul, leaving a permanent, raw scar on her understanding of the world and the inherent darkness that could lurk beneath placid surfaces. She continued her quiet, dedicated duties at St. Jude's, a solitary, unwavering sentinel guarding a terrifying truth that the town, in its collective ignorance or perhaps deliberate denial, adamantly refused to acknowledge. She observed the passing generations, saw the innocent children playing freely in the same sun-drenched fields where the orphanage had once stood, their joyful, unburdened innocence a painful, poignant contrast to the dark, unspeakable history that lay buried, forgotten, directly beneath their tiny, unaware feet. She became, unwittingly, a keeper of whispers, a silent archivist of the unspoken horrors that haunted Willow Creek. Whenever a new grave was dug in the consecrated ground of the cemetery, or an old, forgotten memory was inadvertently stirred in a hushed conversation, she would feel the faint, spectral echo of Father O'Malley's voice, the immense, spectral weight of his desperate confession pressing down upon her spirit. The cluster of unmarked graves continued to stand stoically at the furthest, most desolate edge of the cemetery, a silent, grim testament to a hidden tragedy, their anonymity a constant, chilling reminder of the horrifying truth that lay buried beneath the seemingly tranquil earth, forever waiting to be truly discovered. Willow Creek remained, on its placid surface, a peaceful, unassuming town, its quiet rhythm of life seemingly unbroken by any overt discord. But beneath that carefully constructed veneer of rural tranquility, for those rare few who possessed the courage or the sensitivity to truly listen, the chilling echoes of Father O'Malley's final, desperate confession reverberated, a low, persistent hum of unresolved horror that permeated the very air. The truth, like a restless, tormented spirit, lingered in the humid air of summer nights, in the mournful rustle of the weeping willows that lined the riverbanks, and in the unsettling, profound silence of the lazy river itself, flowing endlessly past the town, carrying with it the unspoken secrets of generations. And so, the harrowing story of the priest who confessed before dying in 1883, Indiana slowly faded into the realm of local legend, a chilling tale whispered in hushed, fearful tones on dark, stormy nights when the wind howled like a banshee through the trees. What he revealed was indeed horrific, a brutal testament to the profound darkness and ruthless cruelty that can cunningly hide itself beneath the deceiving veneer of respectability and prosperity. It stood as a haunting, enduring reminder that some truths, once finally spoken, even in death, can never truly die. They simply linger, forever unacknowledged, perpetually unresolved, and chillingly present, an eternal stain on the soul of a town that chose to forget.
If you like this type of stories, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.